Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. So, today we wanted to actually talk about being angry girls because I actually posted a TikTok not that long ago on my own page where I just talked about being a post highly reactive. Okay, I don't know if I can really say post at this stage because I'm still working through it, but for the most part, I was a post very highly reactive, like chronically angry person growing up. I think in my teens, early 20s, I would sum up like that was a big portion of my personality. I was just highly reactive. And I just made a post kind of talking about coming out of that because I feel like I'm definitely now in a place where I'm not as highly reactive and I've really had to train myself to not be like that. And I've had to just realize like when to pick your battles and what to fight for. And so I was talking about it in this video and someone actually commented, and I'm assuming hopefully they're listening to this podcast right now, but they asked if we had an episode on how to train yourself to come out of being that highly reactive, very chronically angry individual to becoming someone that leads with kindness first and still has their boundaries and still, like puts their foot down when things are wrong, but they don't jump at the first instance at being angry. I think that's the big difference. And I realize we have talked about our experiences being those kind of people in the past and having that anger and resentment, but we've not talked about how we've got to the other side, which I feel like we're probably now in a better position to talk about. So without further ado, Dev, I know we've kind of touched on this idea before, but what's your experiences to begin with of like being that really highly reactive person? And I guess maybe in your early 20s, it was kind of more prominent compared to now.
Yeah, definitely. And while you were talking, I was trying to think about like, oh well, where did our anger come from? And on reflection with my journey with being an angry girl, when I was a teen and my early 20s, I was in a place where I was super resentful of my childhood, the way I grew up, the things that I've been through, which full stop, everyone has gone through like crap, right? Like everyone goes through crap. And this is not to say like, oh, I was such a victim, therefore I was so angry. I just assumed I was like I had a the world is like out to get me mindset. And I also had a like because of all this resentment over like family stuff, I was just very easily triggered by similar situations, and I had no patience. And my anger was mainly contained to like family related situations. I wasn't like angry with like friends or like I worked in retail a lot, and like I had a lot of patience with like customers and stuff like that. I can remember
Yeah,
being quite
same.
like patient, resilient, quiet. Like I'm fairly introverted, but when it came to like closed doors, I was very easily angry with myself. I was very easily triggered by like family and stuff like that. And it's an emotion that really ruled me during my early 20s. And I'm definitely past it now because I've kind of separated the things that can trigger me and my own control of those things. Like I have a greater sense of control of my own emotions now, which I think just comes naturally with age, and also probably comes more naturally to people who have had maybe like dysfunctional growing up situations, maybe people who are like firstborns or eldest daughters, people who've had to just navigate a lot of like maybe like emotional turmoil. Growing out of the anger phase will come to you. And I think something you've talked about a lot is physical boundaries, right?
Mm-hmm.
Physical boundaries, being away from my family for the majority of the like time. Like I don't live with them and I live quite far away from them. That's given me time to actually practice controlling my emotions. So then when I do go see them, I'm like better and better and better at being less angry. And that's happened over like probably the course of I probably started doing this around 23, 24. So over the course of like a good five and a half years, I've slowly become less angry and less like easily triggered. So it's taken a long time, but I still very vividly remember being angry and like the reasons why that like I used to be like that. And I have a lot of compassion for that person, like as in like me, my past self. Like I don't hate that version of myself, which I think is really important when you're trying to overcome like a certain characteristic or like personality trait. I guess if
Mm-hmm.
angry could be a personality trait. Yeah, it's really important to not like hate that part of yourself. You can't like overcome it if you hate it so much. Um, so yeah, I think that's kind of like how I've gotten over it in like a huge tiny nutshell. But what about you? Like, where did your anger kind of come from, and what do you think? Have you taken as long to get over it? I feel like you've done it quite quickly.
Do you think so I was very similar to you. It was very much just like growing up, I just became very like bitter and resentful of like how I felt like I was treated, like in comparison to other people, and like I felt taken for granted, and I felt like there was so many pressures on me that were just like unwarranted. And it was all of the like the build up of all those things, but it was also for me copied behavior.
Oh
Like
my God. Don't get me started on that.
I
Yeah.
I was literally copying what I saw, and I didn't realize. And I feel very, I have to have compassion for myself at the same time, because like when it's all you know, it's all you know. But I just like, it irks me a little bit that it took me so long into even my 20s to realize that that's what I was doing and that it wasn't right. Because you think you're grown at that point, you're an adult. Like, why are you copying behaviors and like not realizing that you're wrong in doing that? So I used to like, I kick myself a little bit even now, thinking like, why did I react to situations like that when it wasn't the right thing to do? But like when it's so hard to realize, even when you know something's wrong, it's like, but it's normal in that scenario. So it almost makes it the right way to behave. It's really twisted. It's really weird, but I think the same as you, like when you talked about the physical distance, that is the only way then I realized, oh, no, this isn't right. And that's not how you, like, that's not how you need to respond to situations. It's just not necessary. And it's not the way to deal with things. Like, if you have a disagreement with someone, if you're not happy with something, and the similar to you, like, I never did it outwardly, like, if I was at work or with anyone else. It was mainly like with the people closest to me. But when you're receiving that kind of treatment, you automatically are gonna like react in that way. But it still goes without saying, like in any situation, it's not necessary to be like that. And there are like, you don't have to be super, super angry. Like, there's a way of kind of dissipating that anger before you then come back with, you know, communicating how you're feeling or just like dealing with the situation. And I think it did end up bleeding into like how I treated my husband and how I like dealt with other like close relationships outside of, like the family you grew up with. And that's when I also realized, oh, this is actually like really not good. Because it's not. And I think that's when I started to really think about what was then like normal behavior. And even though like you've seen something for so many years and you've seen like the way arguments play out and how people communicate with each other when they're disagreeing with each other, and even though you've seen that for such a long time and it's become normalized, it doesn't mean that that's the right way to behave and do things. So that was a big like learning curve for me, because like I just seen so much toxicity, and it was really hard to like see at like another, like what was normal at that point. But then also another element for me was I was diagnosed with PMDD, and that in a nutshell is like, when at that certain time of month you cannot control how you feel, and everything that even shouldn't make you angry makes you angry, and I had that to contend with on top. So it was just so many different things that I felt like I was battling with. But I do feel like since I've kind of had that distance physically, I've been able to like mentally figure out in my head, okay, like what's like a necessary response to certain situations and what isn't, because I'm not seeing as much that way of dealing with situations and being highly reactive. And I feel like when you do pull yourself out of a situation like that, where you're not constantly seeing those kind of behaviors, then you do start to normalize other ways of behaving. So your environment is so impactful in how you kind of end up dealing with situations yourself. So I'll always stand by the fact that like who you surround yourself with, you will become a product of that. Because even in your adulthood, I think you're obviously conditioned in a certain way, like as you're growing up, if it has a bigger impact on you compared to like, okay, if I'm just going to plant myself in a situation as a 28-year-old, it's probably not going to alter my personality that much unless I spent a prolonged period of time there, compared to if I spent all my childhood and like my whole life in an environment that deals with things in a certain way. And then even if I come out of that, I'm going to copy those patterns until I finally break out of it. But I think, yeah, it's probably the quickest way to do it is by that physical distance, because then you have the kind of space to just get away from that as a whole, but then also like figure out, okay, well then how do other people deal with like arguments and disagreements, and how do they deal with like when they're annoyed at things? And I think like also spending so much more time with Sonny compared to anyone else, and seeing how he reacts to like being annoyed and how patient he is, and how, I don't know, I feel like that just molded like my new way of reacting to situations all over again. And then obviously I recognize that it's like really unnecessary to just like react instantly to situations. Like if something annoys you, first of all, like, is it that deep? Second of all, like, even if it is that deep, you can come away from the situation, take a breather, and like regulate your emotions, and then come back and be like, yeah, that was fucked up. Do you know what I mean? Like, you don't have to do it then and then. I always felt like I had to like get something off my chest then and there, or I had to like react in that moment. And that's when things like spiral, because if you're meeting angry with angry, and if you're like disagreeing with someone and you're heated emotionally, that's always like never the best time to actually have like a disagreement with someone. But for some reason in my head, I always used to think, well, then if I've cooled down afterwards and if I don't feel the same, then what's the, like, it was still annoying, but then what's the point in like going back? But then now I'm like, well, actually, that is the whole point. It's not that much of a big deal for you to like have that kind of exchange and feel that kind of crazy emotions and like amplify it by reacting in that moment. It's far better to come away from the situation and then actually assess how you feel once you've regulated your emotions, and then decide to like go and talk it through or whatever. So that's kind of how I've started to approach situations. But it does get me sometimes. Like I still suffer with PMDD, and I still have those moments like things rightfully will like anger me. Like obviously, just because you become someone that's less reactive or highly reactive in the moment or chronically angry about everything doesn't mean that things won't anger you anymore. It just means that you'll find not as much angers you, but then also you find a better way of dealing with that anger and like approaching a situation in a new way. But have you found that like your response to things when you're angry now has like really shifted?
Yeah, definitely. Like I have so much more, like exactly the same as you. There's more time in between me having a reason to get angry, me thinking about it, and then choosing actually not to be angry or like react in like an aggressive way. And I wanted to go back to something you said as well when you were talking about like how much your environment is really important when you're trying to change your, or at least improve your relationship with anger.
Mm-hmm.
I think, yes, like monitoring who you're around is really important, but also like monitoring who's kind of facilitating your anger as well. Because when I was an angry person, right? Well, when I was an angry person, that was me. Like I was angry, I reacted in anger to situations at home. And once I stopped being angry, my like people at home would actually question me not reacting to things. Like I was almost being provoked back into my anger. Like,
That's so real.
it's like people get used to a version of you,
Mm-hmm.
and when you improve or change that version and they're not used to it, they might be in good faith, they're kind of like, oh, why aren't you angry? And it's very easy for you to think, well, why aren't I angry? I should be angry. Yeah, you're right. Or
Now I'm angry.
yeah, now you're angry. Or think, oh, I've actually changed so much so that my environment is picking up on it as well. And I think that was a big turning point for me, because I was almost gestured into believing that I changed for the worse. Like moving out and being around quiet people, or being around, like, for example, Sam is very like, he's grown up in very different circumstances, and he is a lot more patient. He does not react with anger as much as I did. And that's taught me to be more patient as well, just like how Sunny's kind of influenced you. And when I got provoked at home, I would kind of think, oh my God, has my environment like made me a bad person? Like, is change bad? I think we've spoken about that in previous episodes as well. Like, does changing your character make you a bad person? No. Like, even if people ask you, if people notice the change, you are actually allowed to just like change the way you react to things, change the way you think, change your approach to things. And I take so much pride now in when I am at home and there are situations that trigger me, knowing that like I actually used to explode at this, and now I'm choosing not to, and like it's actually in my control. And the control is a big aspect for me as well. It's like a really attractive thing for me to go after that like element of control, because especially with anger, if you react to something with anger, you're actually more likely to be manipulated in that situation as well, because when you're angry, you're super vulnerable, because you're actually just like letting your emotions get the better of you. And when you're vulnerable, yeah, well, you're not in control. And when you're not in control, you can be easily manipulated. And manipulation as well, I don't mean that in like a weird, insidious way. I just mean more like your thoughts could be probed in a way you don't want, or you might say things you regret. You might complicate relationships that you don't want to complicate. You know, there's just so many things that can happen in that situation. Whereas controlling that reaction and letting it sit, and actually, like you say, like you can go back to it and just think, okay, well, what triggered me? Why did it trigger me? Did it have the right to trigger me? And like evaluating all of those things allows you to understand yourself better, allows you to avoid those things more in the future. And again, if you have more control, you've never been manipulated, and you almost stay truer to yourself. And that just, those are all things that just make you feel good about any given situation. It stops those feelings of like regret, playing over situations over and over in your mind, anxiousness, all of those feelings that take away your ability to just kind of like yourself, like your environment, like your life. Those are things that those are things you don't think about when like you're thinking, oh, I want to be less angry. Being less angry has made me a happier person, which sounds ironically obvious, right? Yeah. But that's how. Like, I don't actually have anxiety over situations. I have more control over myself. I know what triggers me, what doesn't, and I know what to avoid in the future. And if I can't avoid those things, I know that I actually will be able to get through it because I have control. So there's a lot in that like sentence, even in itself, I think, that you can like uncover about yourself.
I feel like there's a slight difference between me and you though, because I feel like you've gone back into the situation that used to trigger you, and like you used to have all these behaviors, and you've actually been able to see like, oh, I don't behave like that anymore. But I worry for me, like I haven't had that experience, so I'm like removed from situations that trigger me, and I haven't gone back there. So I'm like, have I changed?
Yeah. Are you just used to the boundary?
Am I just like living in this like peaceful bubble that nothing's triggering me, so I'm not really having a reason to react?
Well, I think that's it there. Like that's maybe like you've got like a limiting belief around like, oh, well, is it just the environment or is it me that's not angry? And I think you not being as angry of a person now is proof that you have the capability to not be angry. You have the capability to practice patience. Like those are all things that you're currently showing yourself you can do. And I think all it would take as if it's such a light task, but if you ever back in like a triggering situation again, it's a case of like you having to really bring your mind back to now and thinking, look, I have it. It's normal for me to not react. It's normal for me to not be angry. I just need to believe that in the moment when the environment is telling me otherwise. Like it's, again, like the power of the mind, isn't it? It's like you've proven it to yourself now. So it's not even like you need to imagine yourself being not an angry person if you were ever in that situation again.
Mm-hmm.
You can actually use your real life experience of not being an angry person
Yeah.
to like convince yourself.
I think what I try to remind myself of if I was to ever be in a position like that again where I'm like super triggered, is to remind myself that I can be angry later.
Yes.
So I don't have to be angry right now, and I can feel what I feel, but I don't have to like speak on it, or I don't have to like even try and get a point across when I'm feeling that emotionally driven and I'm feeling really triggered or like highly reactive. I don't have to react in the moment. I can be angry later. That's what I try and remind myself of. So even if I was in a triggering situation, I'd hope that I would behave that way and be silent. And I think silence is always the best. Like if you feel like you're getting super triggered or like feeling super angry in a situation, sometimes like saying absolutely nothing is the better thing to do, or like absolutely not responding at that not responding at that moment in time, because you can come back later with a clearer head. And like you were talking about, when you've got more control over your mind and your body and like how you feel, and you can be like, I didn't like what you said then. Like I didn't like how that was dealt with and I'm not happy about this. But you can talk about it. You're not reacting at that point. You're just saying like, this is how I feel, and this is like what I'm not happy about, or this is like how I want things to be dealt with in the future. Like you can still have those conversations. It doesn't like mean that, okay, well, if I didn't say it in that moment, the time is done and now I've lost my chance to actually like get my point across or say what I need to say or react to something that really, really annoyed me. I feel like the the perspective that I have now is very different, and I would rather talk about it later, whereas I never used to have that feeling before. I'd be like, well, if it's making me angry now, then I'm going to speak on it now. And I'm already like, I was very emotionally driven, I think, before, whereas I've just tried really hard to come away from that. And it's okay to still feel your emotions. I feel like now I focus more on processing emotion, but that's like an internal thing that doesn't have to be done outwardly when other people are around, or when a situation's like provoked you. You don't have to do it then and there. So yeah, I think that's like quite a big shift, even though it sounds so small. It's like, well, and people talk about it a lot as well. They're like, well, come back to the situation in a clear head. And it sounds very like simple and obvious. But I think when you are someone that's spent so much time being really reactive and being really that person that like, your emotions like take control of you at that point. You don't feel like you're in control of like how you feel, and you feel like you have to react in that moment. It can be hard to listen to advice that's like, oh, just walk away, or just like come back to it, because then you might feel like, oh, well, then it'll trigger me anyway later and I'll feel really emotional about it. But you actually won't, because that initial emotion's been processed and kind of removed from the situation.
Well, I think even like when you say, oh, go away from it and come back, like you don't actually have to like physically go away from anything. And also you don't have to actually like go away for anything for a serious length of time. And one way I actually remember doing this years ago, when was this? Literally probably 7. Yeah, this is 7 years ago at least. And I only remember because it was, yeah, I remember anyway. It was 7 years ago. And I was driving on the motorway with my brother and my grandparents in my car. And my brother and I were just having a really, really like bad argument, but I was driving. And he was getting like, it was getting quite aggressive and stuff. And like, I remember just being like, look, I went silent and I just navigated over to the hard shoulder, stopped the car, and I just asked no one to talk to me for like 30 seconds. I just needed to calm down because I was like, look, I'm actually driving. So this is like dangerous. It's like super dangerous. We're on a motorway. And I knew that like my emotions, it was like a safety risk as well, right? So I knew I needed to calm down. And maybe it was easier because I was on the motorway to actually like command that boundary to be respected at that time. But that was like less than a minute that I just stopped and like just had a like breather to myself with the person who was triggering me right next to me. And got back on the motorway and just went to the destination without saying another word. And I was still angry. Like I was super angry about that situation the whole drive and after that drive as well. But I took that space at the time to allow myself to just like not react and also not be a danger on the road. But it was a good example that like it doesn't have to be like, okay, I'm going to come back to this in a week.
Oh, yeah.
Leave me alone for a week, you know? It's like you can actually just I've even heard advice around like count down from 5 in your head. When you feel like there's something boiling up inside you, or you feel like you're going to scream, or something really triggers you, like count down from 5 in your head and do it as quick or as slow as you can and like see what happens. And it's a case of like doing that over and over again. Like you're not going to be really good at managing or processing your emotions as soon as you listen to this episode. Like you need to do it over and over and over again. And then you get to a point where like it's actually normal for you to get triggered and for you to pause. Like for me, when I get angry, my literal automatic reaction is to like sit with it because it just feels more natural to me now to not react immediately. And that's taken years. So, years, like 5-6 years, you know?
Yeah.
So, it does happen, but you have to like make that decision to pause every single time, and it just gets easier.
Yeah.
With time.
That's a really good point you made, actually. Yeah, I think if you're planning to come back to an argument in a week's time, don't actually even bother because like you're making time hold still. Like that's painful for everyone. Don't do that. Like, yeah, when I mean come back, I mean take that breather, literally how you describe, because there's a fine line between taking that time that you need to actually like process your own emotions to come back and be more level-headed about the situation, but then also dragging issues out. And I feel like if you do intend to like come back to it in even a few days, I just think you're dragging that issue out and knowing that that's like still something lingering that you then want to still tackle later on. If it's something that you just want to let go and you want to come out of the situation and be done with it and just be like, let's park that, and like it doesn't even need nothing else needs to be said about the situation, then fair enough. But I wouldn't recommend coming back to it in a week because you're literally like holding that situation hostage for that entire week and like move on with your life. Like nothing is really ever that deep, like the kind of things that we're talking about in terms of like, yeah, if you have an argument with your sibling or things like that, I feel like they can be resolved in like a shorter time frame, and all it does take is that minute to yourself. Like when we talk about processing emotions, that's not some massive like routine that you have to do. It's literally just sitting there instead of spewing out the first thing that comes to your mind. Because that's not helpful in a situation either.
You can be so mean when you're angry as well.
Honestly. Yeah, and it's just that like it's getting rid of that automatic response, you know, that knee-jerk reaction of like they said something that upset me and now I'm gonna like fight back or defend myself, or I've like something's triggered me a situation and I've got this immediate response back to it. That's what we mean by like stopping that highly reactive nature, is just like getting rid of that knee-jerk reaction, because that's not really you in control of yourself. You've just created like an autopilot. Yeah.
It's also not you.
Like it's like subconscious, I think, when you do that.
Yeah, I agree. I think I want to go back to something you said right at the beginning of the episode, actually, when you were like, you were repeating behaviors as well. That
copying.
Yeah, copying behaviors. And the last week, I think it's just my algorithm for my TikTok For You page, but I've had a lot of posts come up around like growing up in like, you know, like dysfunctional households or angry households and things, and like how that shapes the rest of your life, and like, does growing up with angry parents make you an angry child? And I was getting so upset because some of the posts I found were like actual poems, and like it was from a book someone wrote. It's like someone's written an actual book around like, are you the same as your, like, will you end up being the same as your parents, basically, that kind of thing. And I was getting really upset about it, but because all of the posts and the poems were saying that, yeah, you are, like, you have that within you, you're going to repeat those behaviors. And there's just so much discourse around like, I'm not going to have children until I'm healed, all this kind of stuff. And it made me really think about like how much we're wired, or like how much is wired into us when we're kids, because that's when we're the most susceptible, right? Especially our subconscious. Like, I've talked about it with like money beliefs and stuff as well. Like, the way you approach everything in life is programmed and set, and the key is thrown away by the time you're like 7 or 8 years old. So the work that you have to do to undo that is like quite deep and like complex, but I truly, truly believe it's possible. Like,
Yeah.
I think I was also repeating behaviors as well. Like, and I think it's also quite prevalent in South Asian culture to have like anger in the household, and like angry ways of reacting to things. Like, there's a lot of like authoritarian ways of parenting, disciplining. Like, anger is like probably one of the more dominant emotions in South Asian households, I think, which is unfortunate, but I honestly do think it's reversible, and I want like me and you to be like examples of that, honestly. Like, in terms of like, not examples or look up to us, as in like proof that it's possible.
Proof, yeah.
To
I hope so.
not be angry. And you know how you were saying you're kind of like kicking yourself over taking quote unquote so long to not be angry. I honestly want you to like remember that there's like families that pass down these behaviors for like generations. Like, we've not only tried to overcome these things in our 20s, but we're aware of it, like highly aware of it in our 20s. And we've got so much life ahead of us to like make changes. We've got maybe children we're going to have that are going to like not repeat these same behaviors, no matter how deep down inside us they are. So it's like, we actually are making plenty of progress. And like, I don't want you to ever think that you're not, like, you've done it too late, because you've done it so early. And like, even the fact that you're aware of it is like such a win. But yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge that as well, because I feel like anger it's more of a thing for us, which is sad, but also just part of the story, I think.
Yeah. Do you know what? That's actually so true, because it's a generational thing. So it's obviously been passed down, where people have been like 70 years old and still acting like that.
Yeah.
So
They think it's
true.
normal, how we thought it was normal.
Yeah. There's also, that brings to mind a quote that I read ages ago, and it did make me have like some compassion towards, like, even in generations when things get like trauma gets passed down and what have you. And it said something along the lines of, I think it was like an image based like quote, and it was like, each generation, like, they've kind of got rid of some trauma, but they've still passed on some. So each generation down, there's like less trauma, but there's still trauma there to deal with. And so it in a sense is basically saying, like, have compassion for like the generation before you, because they've obviously dealt with more trauma, which they've tried to deal with themselves, and some of it they've managed to, end with their generation, but they have still passed on trauma. So then you're in your own generation, and the upbringing you've had trauma to deal with, but now you're unpacking and trying to like shed some of that trauma so you don't pass it down. But that still stresses me out, because then I'm like, but what if I then still pass some? Like, I don't want to pass any. I want it to end.
I think it's, yeah, like, I think I had this, like, I have a really deep fear around this, but I'm not even sure if it was you who told me this, or maybe I saw it on TikTok, but it's like, I feel like we almost have to accept that there's going to be a level of not trauma, but there's going to be a level of dysfunction that we can't control or help but pass down. But it's not going to be dysfunction that like ruins a life.
Yeah.
And like we're so self-aware and we're so well-meaning that I think even if anything does get passed down, we will do our best to like help undo it or help manage it or help process it better.
Yeah. I think that's the difference actually, because yeah, I think even if there is a bit of dysfunction or there's these like generational, even like bits of the culture and things that's passed down, as long as the the parent figure is actually like understanding of that being the situation and has accountability for the fact that there is still unhealthy habits that they have shown, and then the child's copied that behavior, and then the child has struggled to like undo that themselves, or like as a result of the way that they've had their upbringing, they have their own traumas, and don't belittle that because they had a bit more than they've passed down. I think in that case, like even if there has been a dysfunctional setting in some form, hopefully it still isn't so crazy toxic that it would like break up a family, or it would, you know, cause that person like so many issues like growing up and their upbringing and not be able to like overcome those things, because there's been that accountability and because there's been that support and because there's been that like open communication around those things. I think when it becomes really damaging is when things are brushed under the carpet and things are like taught to be not that big a deal, and like you should just deal with it, and what you're dealing with it isn't a big deal, and there's been worse before you, so why are you complaining, and all those kind of really negative and like unhelpful phrases that we hear over and over again. That is what makes trauma stick, and that's what creates more. So you're
Yeah.
like,
And you know what? On that, I've recently learned from Lord TikTok that accountability is actually a form of love.
yeah,
And I honestly, like when I read it was like a carousel and I read it and I put my phone down because I was like it actually is, because the lack of accountability is so hurtful, like
yes,
deeply hurtful. And lack of accountability equals those exact things you just described, brushing things under the rug.
it's a form of neglect, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, I
It
mean it
has to
has to
be.
be.
Because I think, do you know how many problems I feel like would be resolved if like people just took accountability for like how they've made someone feel or treated someone, or, and I'm talking about like a parent child situation here more in particular, because that's how you create these angry children, and that's how people become resentful and bitter, because the people that have brought them up or like put them in these situations refuse to acknowledge that that's what they've done, even if it's accidental. You can still acknowledge and be like, do you know what? Yeah, we were angry and you did copy that behavior, and now, and you were brought up in that environment that wasn't very healthy. And I'm sorry for that. I didn't mean for that to be the case, but like, let's help figure out how we, and just be that support. But they don't want to do that. They, a lot of the time, they don't unfortunately want to do that. And they just want to like push the blame onto someone else and not have any responsibility for that, or feel like, well, they did the best they could, and if my best isn't good enough, then it's a you problem. And that is just the worst way to carry on these like habits of people being angry and resentful again, because now you've got a new generation that's bitter at the older generation not being accountable.
Yeah, and like I feel like it's quite an encouraging thought to think, okay, well, the lack of accountability made me this way, and it means that okay, I don't have to fully heal before I have children if I get to have children or if I want children later. But if I do pass down any kind of dysfunction, if I stay accountable, I will still make children feel like loved and appreciated and seen. And like that's what deepens bonds and creates tight family units. So there is a way through dysfunction. And I think it's like believing and embracing that will allow you to like continue without this like all or nothing mindset towards healing yourself as well.
Yeah. The idea of like being right as well, I think, is such a weirdly rooted thing in our culture. Is that like, why do you have to be right all the time? I actually don't get that. Like, are you gonna die if you're not right in the situation? Probably not. So, like, why force that, and why act like it's the end of the world if like you're not seen as right in a situation? It's totally fine to be in the wrong, and it's totally fine for other people to like not ridicule you for being in the wrong. I think that's also an issue.
That's the thing. Yeah.
It's like if you're in the wrong, then you get like really negatively treated to the point where in another situation you're terrified of being seen in the wrong because of that. And I think that's what perpetuates it. So yeah, I'd like to think if I ever did have kids, I'd make it so okay to be wrong and make mistakes and not be shamed for that. But then also for myself, like I would like to think that I have to make myself okay with being in the wrong. Like your child can absolutely be right in some situations. And I feel like that's also a really weird like respect thing. It's like, oh, you don't have respect for your elders if like you think they're wrong.
Yeah.
They're human too. Like what the hell?
You're actually, yeah. You're so bang on with that. That's actually crazy.
So frustrating. But yeah, these are kind of things I think about in terms of like being angry and having, yeah, these emotions. Like that's where it stems from. But there's also like so many ways that you can avoid like those things like continuing and that cycle continuing by recognizing that like how many like odd things that we just like believe and accept. Okay, so I think we'll leave the episode there. Hopefully we've been really helpful to all the angry girls out there that, you know, needed just a word of advice in terms of toning down being super reactive to situations and just being chronically angry, because we get it. We've been there, kind of half still there. Like I don't know if I've fully gotten over it, but I think there's definitely things that you can do to chip away at that like auto response to situations and feeling like really emotionally driven all of the time. So hopefully we've given you a bit of an insight on how we've managed to make steps towards that. If you have enjoyed the episode, please do give it a thumbs up if you're watching us on YouTube, and make sure you give us some feedback if you are listening over on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And with that being said, we'll catch you in the next episode. Bye guys.
Bye.